There it goes. All right, thank you everyone for joining us for tonight's lecture. I'm your host, Katie Zimmerman from Lake Johnson, and we've got Patrick Brannon here from the WCU Highlands Biological Station. As a friendly reminder, this lecture will be recorded. If you do not wish to appear on the recording, please turn your camera off. To reduce feedback, everyone was muted upon entrance. If you have questions during the presentation, please utilize the chat feature and I will read them out when appropriate. Please know there will be time for Q&A at the end of the lecture. And with that, I will pass it on to you, Patrick.
Hi, everyone. Let me share my screen quickly. There we go. Everyone can see that, I hope. Anyway, my name is Patrick Brannon. I'm the outreach specialist at the Highlands Biological Station, which is part of Western Carolina University. We're just not on the main campus. If you're not familiar with this part of the state, Western Carolina University is about an hour and a half west of Asheville, and then Highlands Biological Station is another hour west of that. So we're in the kind of extreme southwest corner of North Carolina. But what the station is we're a field station. We're almost 100 years old. We were founded in 1927. But it's a place where scientists come from all over the world to study the plants and animals of our southern Appalachian mountains. Oops. Sorry. Sorry, I hit a button I didn't mean to hit. But my job at the biological station is I'm kind of two things. Where I'm a biologist and I do research on salamanders and shrews, which we're going to talk more about shortly. But also, my kind of day-to-day job is that I travel all around schools in Western North Carolina to like a 12-county distance, travel around and give all grades different kinds of science and nature lessons. So I bring animals to schools and I take them out in the woods on the Appalachian Trail and do all sorts of things. But as I mentioned, on the side, when I have the opportunity, I perform research on both salamanders and shrews. The biological station is located here because it's in the center of a biological hotspot. Well, the thing that we're kind of most famous for is salamander research. You can see it's part of our logo down here, because this is the center of salamander diversity in North America, maybe even in the whole world. But what a lot of people don't realize is that is also the shrew capital of North America. We have as many as 8 species of shrews in the southern Appalachian Mountains. But many of you are asking, well, what is a shrew? A shrew is a small mammal, and you look at that and you might say, well, it looks a little bit like a mouse. Why this thing keeps dragging over. But it is not a mouse. Okay, it is a small mammal, has fur and so forth, but mice and shrews are in completely different groups. A mouse is a type of rodent, along with squirrels and rats and chipmunks and voles with a V, not moles with an M. A vole is kind of like a mouse, but it has a short tail and furry ears, and their teeth are a little bit different too, but they're all small rodents. Rodents, whether you're talking about a giant beaver or a little bitty mouse, all have teeth like this. They have these big buck teeth, these big elongated upper, front, and lower incisors that are constantly growing because they're always chewing on things and gnawing them down. And I mean, gnawing on things and wearing them down. So to compensate for tooth wear, their incisors are constantly growing. The outer edge of the incisor is hard and the inner side is softer. That way, when they are wearing down, they wear unevenly and they make this nice sharp chisel point that they use to, like a beaver chews on trees, squirrels chew on acorns. They're also for snipping grasses and gnawing on seeds. So they're herbivores. They're plant eaters primarily. They sometimes eat insects, but they're primarily herbivores. And because of that, they're missing teeth here. On other animals like foxes or whatever that are carnivores, they have their big long canine teeth here, their fangs. But since they're herbivorous, there's a gap here called diastema. And then in the back, they have these flattened molars that are used to grind up plant material. I mentioned mice and voles. They look very similar except for their tail length, but also their molars are different. So in mice, they have these kind of round molars like we do, whereas voles have these zigzag molars. They're all kind of one piece. Shrews, however, are not rodents. They're in a completely different group of mammals called insectivores. They're in the same group, or more or less in the same group, with moles. Okay, so they're insect eaters. They're not really herbivores. They're insectivorous. Most of you are familiar with moles. Moles are characterized by these big front feet with these big long claws that they use like shovels for tunneling underground. But if you look at a shrew, they do not have these big front feet. So they root around for insects on the surface of the ground, under the leaves and the forest floor. But otherwise, they're very similar to moles. So let's take a minute and talk about moles. As we said, they have these big front feet that are like shovels that scoop away the dirt. They have really fine fur or short fur. That way they don't get stuck in the tunnel underground. They do have eyes and ears, but they're extremely tiny. You can't really see them because being underground, you can't really use them anyway. You can't see or hear if you're buried in the dirt. And their front end and back end kind of look the same. That way they can slide back and forth in their tunnel because they can't turn around in there. But anyway, so shrews are similar to moles, but they root around on the surface. So insectivores have teeth like this. We said the rodents have the big buck teeth for gnawing on plants and seeds and things. But moles and shrews have these sharp, pointy teeth. Bats have teeth like this too. Bats are in another group, but they're also insectivorous, most of them, in North Carolina at least. So they have these sharp, pointy teeth for shredding up those hard exoskeletons of other insects and other invertebrates like worms and things like that. On shrews, they even have these kind of hooked incisors that they use like tweezers for picking up tiny insects. So very different animals. Even but they're both small mammals. They're in completely different groups. So in the southern Appalachian Mountains, it depends on where you are, what elevation, and so forth. But there's three main kinds of shrews. The main one, and this is statewide, is the eastern mole. Eastern mole is characterized by having this naked or hairless tail. Okay, this is a Easter. I keep forgetting I had these. This is an eastern mole here. Hopefully you can see that. My little window that has me in it, I can't view at the moment. So hopefully you're seeing this. There's his big front feet and naked tail. But if you'll notice, they have really enlarged front feet because they're found statewide in all types of soil. So they have to have these very robust front feet for digging through that hard red clay you might find in the Piedmont and places like that. But here in the mountains, we have a second species called the hairy-tailed mole. So it's similar, except instead of having a hairless tail, it has a hairy tail. So this is a hairy-tailed mole here. And if you look, its front feet are large, but not as large. So that tells you a little bit about the habitat in which it lives. These are found in mountain forests, and in the mountains, we have this dark, wet, black soil. So it's softer soil, so therefore they don't need as big of a shovel. Then there's this kind of rare species called the star-nosed mole. This is only found out on the coast and in isolated locations in the mountains, not in the Piedmont. It has this weird nose with 22 little tentacles on it that it uses to kind of feel around for insects in the dark, in the tunnels. They're found mostly in really swampy habitats. So out in the coast, like Great Dismal Swamp and places like that, and then here in the mountains, in mountain bog habitats. So it has a much longer tail and this weird nose and even smaller front feet because it doesn't have to really tunnel. It just has to kind of scoop away the mud. All right. A lot of people see moles as pests because they can tunnel up your yard and make these big humps. And not everybody likes that. It does aerate the soil when they do that, but it does make these kind of unsightly humps in the dirt. However, moles are often falsely implicated in eating flower bulbs. My grandmother used to always say, "Oh, I hate these moles because they're eating up all my daffodils and things like that." But remember, moles and shrews are insectivores. So they're not really eating the roots. Those are voles, not moles, that are doing that. Rodents eating the plants. All right, but in the mountains, we also have lots and lots of shrews. They're found statewide as well, but the different kinds than we have here in the mountains. We have more of them here in the mountains. But the most common one is the northern short-tailed shrew. It's about the size of a mouse. But again, you can tell it's a shrew and not a mole because it has small front feet, doesn't tunnel underground. But you can also tell it's not a rodent because it has really minuscule ears and eyes, unlike a mouse. Really short, fine fur. If you have a cat, undoubtedly they probably have killed these before, but they seldom eat them because they'll kill them, but they don't really eat them. The shrews often give off this musky odor as a defense, and so they're kind of distasteful and don't want to be eaten. The northern short-tailed shrew is a venomous mammal. There's not very many of those in the world, but the short-tailed shrews are. But it's not venomous like a rattlesnake or something like that. It's a very mild venom in its saliva, but what it's used for is to paralyze insect prey. And you might be wondering, well, why does it do that? Why doesn't it just kill it? Because when it bites it, it paralyzes the prey, but it doesn't kill it outright. Well, the advantage of keeping it alive instead of just killing it is that if they can't eat it there on the spot, they can take it back to their nest and store it, and it won't spoil. So it can't move and get away, but it's also alive, so it won't rot. I've been bitten by those before, and my finger went numb for about an hour. It's kind of like getting a shot of Novocaine at the dentist, but it's otherwise harmless to humans. That's the short-tailed shrew. And that's genus Blorina. In other parts of the state, there's the southern short-tailed shrew, but in the mountains, we have northern short-tailed shrew. But most other shrews are in the long-tailed shrew group, which is genus Sorex. And the largest of those in the mountains is the smoky shrew. Sorex fumeus, smoky, because it has a smoky kind of grayish fur. This is a smoky shrew here. You can see it's smaller than this other one, but still pretty big for a shrew. But you can see the scale of one here on this leaf. So they're tiny little animals, but they get progressively smaller. So that's a big one. The next smallest one is called a masked shrew. And I'm not really sure why they call it a masked shrew because it doesn't have a mask like a raccoon or something. But if you look at the scientific name, it's Sorex cinereus. Cinereus, like cinnamon, because it has this kind of reddish brown fur. So this is a masked shrew, and you can see how much smaller it is against my hand. But as small as that one is, it's not the smallest. There's one that's even smaller called the pygmy shrew. The pygmy shrew is the smallest mammal in North America and the second smallest mammal in the world. There's one called a bumblebee bat that's even smaller, but that doesn't live around here. But the pygmy shrew is the smallest one in North America. Here's its skull next to a dime for scale. I don't have a specimen of that to show you, unfortunately. But they're tiny, tiny, tiny little animals, and they root around the leaves and eat teeny tiny insects. And there's some other species as well. But those are the main ones. But what is special about the southern Appalachian Mountains? Why does this region in particular have so many different kinds of shrews and so many of them? They're found in other parts of the state, but not nearly at these numbers. Well, part of it has to do with the regional topography, especially here where I am in Highlands. Highlands, North Carolina is right here in the corner of Georgia and South Carolina, but we're right on the edge of the Blue Ridge Escarpment, this cliff, if you will, of the mountains. So there's a very abrupt elevational shift. You can drive just 30 minutes down the mountain and you've dropped 3,000 feet in elevation. So it's just very abrupt shift, which means you're going to have both northern high elevation species and southern low elevation species all in this region. So you get kind of a double dose of these. So at high elevations, like up here in Highlands, we get the smoky shrew, and that ranges all the way up into New England and into Canada. But then down in the valleys, or if you go down just down the mountain into South Carolina, it's replaced by the southeastern shrew, which ranges all the way down into Florida. So at this latitude, you could get either group, the southern or northern species. But within that latitude, those groups are separated by elevation. So you get these northern species on the mountain tops, and then the southern species down in the valleys or down at the base of the mountain. So they're not exactly coexisting, but they're in the same general region. So what you get, if you look at the mountains here, is some places like up in Boone, for example, you'll only get these northern species. But along the edge of the mountains, you could potentially get either one. So we have kind of, again, a double dose of the number of species. However, within that band where they can coexist, you still won't find them in the same habitat. So they're still segregated by habitat type. Those northern species like the cooler, wetter forest, as you would find at higher elevations or farther north. So things like mass shrews, you're only going to find on north-facing wet slopes, mesic slopes, or in riparian zones, down near creeks and streams and rivers. But other things like the short-tailed shrew are habitat generalists. They can be found anywhere, north, south, hot, dry, so forth, wet, dry. Okay. So what you wind up with, depending on where you are, whether you're at the top of the mountain or the base of the mountain, you're going to get different groups of species. So at high elevation, you get these northern species. You get the pygmy shrew, mass shrew, smoky shrew, and northern short-tailed shrew. And then at low elevations or farther south, you get a different set. The pygmy shrew is again a tiny one. This is it here. But you'll notice where they coexist, there's a small, medium, large, and if you include the short-tailed shrew, an extra large species. So there's 4 different species, 4 different sizes, and that's how they can coexist. By being different sizes, they occupy slightly different microhabitats and eat slightly different prey, so they're not in direct competition with one another. So at the low elevations, you have the same kind of species counterpart. You have a tiny one. There's one called a least shrew, which I haven't talked about. It looks like a miniature short-tailed shrew. It's tiny. It's about the same size as the pygmy shrew, but with a short tail. So it has a species counterpart that fills that niche at lower elevations. The mass shrew is replaced by the southeastern shrew, which looks a lot like it, but it's a different species. There is no species complement to the smoky shrew at low elevations, but then the northern short-tailed shrew is replaced by the southern short-tailed shrew. So we have all these 7 species, and occasionally you get some other ones too. There's some rare species. There's one called a rock shrew, which has this big, thick, ropey tail, but it's only found kind of in like boulder fields and places like that because it's the same size as the smoky shrew. So it's in direct competition, and the other one's much more numerous. So it's kind of restricted to these small microhabitats. And there's one called a water shrew, which is a rare species that lives in creeks and actually has kind of fringed feet that it uses to, like little flippers, to kind of dive under the stream and eat aquatic insects. So scientists who study shrews, you can't really catch shrews in traps like you do, like a traditional kind of aluminum box trap you get set for mice and stuff. Occasionally they may wander in there, but that's just accidental. They're not really attracted to bait like peanut butter or something like you would put in for a mouse. Instead, the way you collect shrews is through a device called a pitfall, which is just a big plastic bucket sunk flush into the ground. And then sometimes it's done in conjunction with this aluminum drift fence, which is just kind of like a silt fence. But what happens is these shrews root around in the leaves and they encounter the fence and they can't go over it, can't go under it, so they have to try to go around it. So it kind of funnels them down the length of the fence, and then they go, and fall down into this bucket, and they can't get out. So it's like a little kind of Burmese tiger trap on a smaller scale. So that's the traditional way you catch shrews, but it's really labor intensive. You have to go out there, carry all these buckets out in the woods and dig holes. You have to check them all the time because the animals will be in there and they rot because they don't live very long if you don't tend to them. It's a lot of work. Well, what I've been doing instead is looking at discarded bottles as traps. Unfortunately, as you probably have seen all over the state, there's lots and lots of trash on the sides of highways. And what happens is these shrews will root around in the leaves and go into these bottles, just in search of water or just exploring. And then they can't get back out again, especially in the mountains because the bottles often land in this position. It's called a kill position where they're They're on a slope. So it's like a miniature pitfall trap. So they fall down in there and they can't get out. So what my students and I have done is we have gone around and collected trash bottles off the sides of the roads and examined their contents to try to find skeletal remains of these little creatures. And so it's not very labor intensive. You don't have to go there and set traps, and you can do it at your leisure because you didn't like open the trap overnight and wait for something to fall in. They're just out there catching stuff. So whenever it's a nice day, you can just go look for bones and bottles, and we can use that in two different ways. First thing is we're just using it as a survey technique. So we go to a site, we collect bottles, we can get a GPS coordinate and note the elevation and habitat type, and so we know where that species found, and we can map their distributions. The other thing is we did a study on the effects of littering, like looking at mortality rates and conservation implications for some of these rarer species. So what my students and I have done over the years is we have or had over 220 sites all across multiple counties in North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia, at the top of the mountain and down at the base of the mountain. And all we do is we just pull over on the side of the road. Usually we kind of restrict it to these pull out areas on mountain roads because those are where bottles tend to accumulate in greater volumes because people have also pulled over there to like go to the bathroom or just eat dinner or whatever, and they'll throw their trash out. So we just pull over on the side of the road and we just go down into the edge of the woods and walk up and down the length of the road for 100 meters or so looking for bottles. And if we encounter a bottle that has something in it, we'll examine its contents. At the same time, we got the elevation and we classified the habitat type based on moisture from a class 1, which is the really hot, dry pine forest that you find farther down the mountain in South Carolina, all the way up to class 5, which are these cove hardwood, wet mountain stream habitats like you'd find up here in Highlands at the top of the mountain. That way we can get some habitat associations with these animal remains that we are finding. So this is what it looks like. So it looks a little bit like an owl pellet, if you know what those are. Owls barf up the remains of their prey, and it's this big ball of fur and bones. Well, an animal that's been trapped in a bottle decomposes, and you get the same stuff. If you're lucky, it's nice and dry and kind of stuck to the inside of the bottle, and you just break the bottle open and get it out. Unfortunately, most of the time, it's really nasty because it's these rotted things that haven't been in there as long, and it's just this ball of stinky slime that you have to bloop, bloop, bloop out of the bottle. But nevertheless, you get out all these bones, and then you can identify the remains based on the skull and other features. So here, this is actually all from one bottle, believe it or not. There was 22 skulls and 3 different species out of this one bottle. But here we have some smoky shrew skulls, and these are short-tailed shrew skulls, and then this is some kind of rodent here. Oops. But identifying shrew skulls is difficult because, as I've shown you, okay, they are tiny little animals. So you have to use a dissecting microscope to see these things. I've seen them enough now that I can just see them in my hand, and I can usually tell what they are. But to confirm your identification, you have to look at them under the scope. And the way you do it mainly is by their teeth. So these tiny skulls and these tiny, tiny teeth, if the teeth are still in the skull, which they often fall out if they've been in the bottle for a long time. But without getting to all the specific details, sometimes you can go by the size of the skull is an easy way to tell the difference. But if they're similar size, you've got to count teeth. So on a shrew, they don't have canine teeth. They have these things called unicuspid teeth. They have like 4 or 5 or 3 sometimes different single cusped teeth. So for a similar size shrew, you can count these teeth and see if they are the same number, different numbers, or different configurations. So these 2 species are very comparably sized. This is the mass shrew. This is the southeastern shrew. The mass shrew has a slightly longer, narrower snout than this one. You can see this one's a little wider and that one's skinnier. They have a more bulbous brain case than this one. But if you look at their teeth, the mass shrew has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 unicuspid teeth that are all kind of the same size. But on the southeastern shrew, there's one, two, three, four, five, but the third one and the fifth one are much smaller than all the rest. So that's the level of detail you have to do. So it's very tedious until you get the hang of it. So anyway, after collecting all these specimens, we analyzed our data, and we found that the short-tailed shrew is ubiquitous. It's everywhere. It's at all elevations, all habitat types. So pretty much, if you're going to find something in a bottle, that's the one you're going to find all the time. But if you look at things like smoky shrews, which is a northern high elevation species, okay, we got it almost exclusively up in North Carolina in the mountains, and just a little bit as you go down the mountain. There's one that we found way down here in Georgia, but it's along the Chattooga River, and the habitat type there is very comparable to that of higher elevations. But then when you get to these two species, these are ones that are the same size and fill the same ecological niche. There's no overlap between those. The mass shrew was found only in North Carolina in the mountains, high elevation, and the southeastern shrew was only found at lower elevations and in different habitat types. So the mass shrew is in very wet habitats, southeastern shrew is in very dry habitats. So we call this contiguous allopatry, which means they abut one another, but they don't overlap. So here's the results here. So we examined over 10,000 bottles at our 220 sites, and bottles were defined as any open container with a narrow neck. So mostly it was soda and beer bottles, but things like milk jugs or oil bottles or wine bottles, all those things kind of counted as bottles. But bottle, we don't want all that trash on our highways, but they're only dangerous to animals if they don't have their caps. However, 59% of those bottles that are out there didn't have their bottle cap, which means they are potentially a trap. So the average number of traps, open bottles at each site was 28. So there's lots of trash on our highways. And that's just the ones that are open. So there's an average of 382 open bottles per mile of road in our mountains. So lots and lots of traps out there to potentially capture these small mammals. And if you do all the math, that equates to nearly 2 million trap nights, or 382 trap nights per year. A trap night is a chance for an animal to be captured. So if you have one bottle and it's out there for 100 nights, that's 100 trap nights. Or you could have 100 bottles out there for only one night, and that's still 100 trap nights. So it's just opportunities for animals to be captured. So we did it 1 year, and then a few years later, we went back and repeated our study just to see if there were more bottles being accumulated, if people were continuing to litter. Because when we did the study, we didn't collect the bottles. We only took out the bottles that had things in it. There's no way we could do litter sweeps of all these mountain roads. We'd have to have dump trucks to do that. So most of the bottles we just left in place. And we went back a few years later and counted the bottles again to see if there was a gain. The good news, if you can call it that, is of all those sites, there was only a net gain of 150 open bottles. So about one bottle per site each year. So people aren't continuing to litter very much, and that's good. However, all the bottles that are there or were there are still there because no one's cleaning them up. So even though the accumulation rate is slow, they're still out there catching animals. And even one bottle a year is still an increase. It's just a very small increase. So here's a breakdown of some of the animals that we captured. Mostly shrews, and mostly those short-tailed shrews because they're bigger and they are less likely to escape than a little animal. But we also got lots of rodents as well, mice, voles, and even a mole, one hairy-tailed mole. So nearly 700 animals we removed. But the main thing is the capture rate. The capture rate is nearly 12%, which is extremely high. And it's a bad thing, but it's also kind of a good thing for teaching. So, for example, there's a group from Clemson University that comes up pretty much annually. It's the mammalogy class. And I take them out looking for remains in bottles. And for a teaching standpoint, um, it's good because we can spend literally like 10 minutes and we found a bottle with an animal in it. So that's really sad, but it's useful information. So anyway, we got got a total of 12 different animals or mammal species. But we also occasionally got some other groups as well. We found a couple of salamanders, one little tiny ringneck snake, but those animals can usually escape better than the mammals. But also lots of invertebrates, beetles, millipedes, and snails, including some that are rare or endangered, can be trapped in these things too. So I haven't personally looked at snails in these bottles, but the data is there for somebody who wants to look at it. Most of the sites we found something. It was very uncommon, unfortunately, that we didn't find something at a site. And usually we found more than one animal at each site. 5% of the bottles had something in it. If you found one thing in a bottle, usually there was more than one thing. So the average is two. It's not because the remains of one animal attracts another. I think it's more the position of the bottle. So it's a good bottle, or position good to catch animals, is going to catch multiple animals. And as I mentioned earlier, the most we got from a single bottle was 22 skulls consisting of 3 different species. But anyway, we did all the math of rate of capture and blah, 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 blah. And we calculated the annual mortality rate to be 3%. And that equates to 40 small mammals killed per mile each year along our mountain highways, just because people are disposing their bottles on the sides of roads. Now, this phenomenon occurs statewide, but it's much more pronounced in the mountains than it is in the other parts of the state, mainly because of our terrain. So in the mountains, if you go down these back country roads, a lot of people don't want to take their trash to the dump, so they just dump their stuff down the hill into the woods. So in addition to trash bags and bottles and cans and so forth, you find things like washing machines, sofas, sometimes old cars. It's this horrible thing way down in the mountain, in the ravines in the mountains. And in the mountains, if somebody does throw a bottle out of the car window, it doesn't just lay on the corner or the edge of the road, because here we have steep terrain. So it's not going to stay there. It's going to roll way, way down into the woods and get buried in leaf litter. And being on a slope, the bottles are more likely to land in that kill position on an incline instead of being flat. In this position, animals can't get out. But if it lays flat, like it is out on the eastern part of the state, it can still trap an animal, but they have a greater chance of escaping. And in the kill position, they can collect rainwater. So if the animal does get in there, it might drown in a little puddle of water at the bottom of the bottle. So there are periodic efforts to clean up our roads by different organizations and the DOT, but they only get trash that's right on the shoulders of roads that are visible from the highway. But that's not where you find the bones in the bottles. You find those way down the hill, sometimes as far as 100 meters from the road into the woods, and nobody goes and picks that stuff up ever. So over the decades, these bottles can accumulate. And that whole time, they're continuously trapping animals. We know that for a fact because we find bottles they don't even make anymore. Things like glass Clorox bottles with remains of animals inside, or a soda bottle that has promotional material on it from a movie, like we found one that had Back to the Future 1985 on it. So that doesn't mean the animal that was in the bottle had been in there since 1985, but it does mean that trap has been functioning since 1985. This is the poster from England. In England, they're trying to get the word out about don't throw bottles on the sides of the roads. Here in America, we have anti-littering campaigns, but it's mostly focused on beautification of our highways. There's that old ad from the 70s where somebody throws a trash bag out and the Native American Indian starts to cry because it's so ugly. But we're trying to get the word out that it also can kill lots and lots of small mammals and other wildlife. All right. I'm going to stop there. And if you have any questions, I'll be happy to try to answer them.
Wow, that was super informative. I learned so much. Thank you so much, Patrick. If anyone has questions for Patrick, please feel free to put them in the chat, or you can unmute yourself and ask them out loud. You can also do a raised hand feature if you prefer that. That is entirely up to you. So yeah, if you've got any, go ahead and throw them out.
And I didn't really continue my talk because we're getting low on time, but I wanted to mention that there's some applications of this. So my wife is a middle school science teacher. And so each year she takes her eighth grade out and collects or picks up litter for Earth Day. And so several years I've gone out with them and tell them to keep the bottles. And then we take that back to the classroom and we can analyze these remains, and they can do things like learn how to use GPS and map these things. They can learn skeletal anatomy, how to use a dichotomous key to identify these shrews, and so forth. I'll learn how to just do science as a citizen scientist.
That's really cool. Is that something you can do? So you can do that anywhere in the state, right? It's just go on the road and like, or go near a road and
You're
start
not going to
collecting
find as many
bottles.
things in bottles in the eastern part of the state, but it still happens there. Yes, it's just here in the mountains.
Okay.
You don't have to try hard, and you find stuff out
Right.
there. You have to really search for them, but there are, unfortunately, in the bottles there too. There's a study from Virginia, from I think Norfolk or Suffolk, Virginia, where somebody did this and they found lots of things there too.
That's really good to know. Okay. I have a couple of questions. I like wrote down a bunch. So I'm oh, good. Hannah's got one too, but I'll go ahead and ask mine while she's typing. I think you just answered this at the end, and my attention just like happened to wander. How do you know how long the bottles have been out, catching things?
We don't really.
Oh, okay.
We can just say whether it's an old bottle or a more recent bottle, but unless, like I said, it has something that indicates what year that was from, like movie logos and things like that on it. But otherwise, we don't really know for sure. But like we found, glass milk bottles, glass Clorox bottles, which I don't know how long since those existed. So it's like the
Right.
50s or something. So,
Wow.
but
Okay.
again, I don't know when the animal got in there. Just the bottle has been there.
Right. And then you said you have a capture rate. How I didn't wasn't quite sure what that number meant. Like, how do you calculate a capture rate?
It's I kind of glossed over that because it's complicated math formula,
Oh, okay.
but it
I don't
takes
need to
it
know the
takes
whole
into
formula.
account. Well, like the first time we went out, we emptied all the bottles that we found. So we kind of zeroed them out. And then we went back like 2 years later. So we know whatever we found then has been captured within the last 2 years. We just don't know exactly when. So that way.
Gotcha. Okay. Hannah's asking, have you had any experience finding shrews or other critters in materials like plastic bags, where you can find, I'm not sure what you mean, Hannah, by usable remains? I guess like remains of like kind of like what you find
Uh,
inside of bottles.
to answer your question, we only found them in bottles. But again, bottles is kind of a broad category. So like milk jugs, antifreeze containers, anything with an open mouth and a narrow neck. Other people have found them in aluminum cans, but we never did. We examined aluminum cans, but we never found any mammal remains in cans, presumably because they're light enough that they can wiggle and turn it in such a way that they can escape. I'm guessing, but I know in other places, I think in Tennessee or so, somebody found lots of them in cans. So anything can potentially be a trap, but not plastic bags and things. They can chew their way out of that or get out more easily.
That's good. But they can't chew their way out of like plastic bottles.
Apparently not.
Hmm, interesting. Maybe it's like the
The
plastic's not soft enough.
Sometimes though, when these bottles get filled with water, in the winter times it'll freeze and it'll bust the bottle. And so
Mm,
that no longer functions as a trap. But when we're searching, we always examine the base of the bottle, even if it's broken, because you can still find remains down in what used to be the bottom of the bottle.
very cool. Um, so I know the short-tailed shrews are venomous. What is it that they're eating, you think, that is that they need that venom, whereas these other shrews are not venomous?
It's just to immobilize. They eat larger prey because they're larger
Larger.
shrews. So it's just
Okay.
to immobilize those and keep them alive in the event that they can't eat them on the spot. Shrews have super fast metabolisms, And so if they encounter an animal that they want to eat, they don't want to have to hunt for it later. So they just stun it, and then they can eat it at their leisure.
Do they only eat arthropods or will they eat like
They eat all
anything
sorts of
that?
invertebrates. They're very uh, generalistic diets as far as this,
Okay,
the spiders, worms, beetles, all that stuff.
very cool. Go. Sydney is asking, other than an Earth Day lesson, what types of lessons do you teach while visiting schools?
Oh, I encourage you to go to our website, which is highlandsbiological.org. I can't name them all here because I have over 50 different ones, ranging from preschool all the way through college classes. But it's an extensive menu, and even for those, there's different versions depending on what grade level it is. So really, it's more than 50 because I can do like a tree class at the kindergarten level, middle school level. So, but there's lots and lots of things, and some are field based. Like my wife, I mentioned, um, teaches at middle school science, but we're close enough to the Appalachian Trail that she takes her students as part of their watersheds unit in the 8th grade as a state curriculum, up on the trail, and they hike sections of the Appalachian Trail and examine stream, and they do all sorts of chemical testing on these streams. But I meet them up there and do a salamander study, to look at salamanders as biological indicators of water quality, and then they, based on what we find or don't find living in the creek, they can then confirm the results through chemical tests. But there's all sorts, there tons of stuff. Sometimes I just bring a turtle to the school as kind of a show and tell, or a snake, or sometimes we do more elaborate things. Like there's a lichen study that we can do to examine them as indicators of air quality, and I can do that even in the classroom. I can bring in like lichens and pictures of trees covered with lichens that we can. So there's an outdoor version, an indoor version, and on and on and on and on. I can do like bears. I don't have a live bear, but I bring like bear skulls, and anyway, there's tons and tons of different options. And I can, if you're if you're a teacher and you're interested, um, please reach out to me, even if you're not in the area. A lot of these things, one of the silver linings of COVID was that I had to reimagine my programming in a virtual format, like I'm doing now. Um, so many of my classes I can still do virtually too. Like I can have a turtle and show you and talk to you through the camera, or even some of these ones where we have data collection. We can't collect the data, but I can give you data, and then the students can analyze it and so forth. So reach out to me, even if you're in another part of the state, and we can see what we can work out.
Awesome. Thank you, Patrick. I send a follow-up email at the end of after the lectures, towards like the end of the week, before the end of the week. And it'll include your EE forms. It'll include the video of this recording. And it will, if you would like, Patrick, I can also include the website, and I can include your email so that people can reach out to you and schedule these programs.
But yeah, if you go to our website, look under outreach, because there's the nature center, which has a bunch of public programs, but then school outreach is what you want to look for. I'll see some other, I'll
Yep.
pulled up the chat here and I see some other questions.
Yep.
So
I've been
Kelly
there.
asked, what are the ecological benefits of studying shrew death rates? Some of it's just to, encourage people not to litter is the main thing, beyond just the visual component, how ugly it makes our highways. But also for some of these species, they're rare. They're not necessarily endangered, but they're of conservation concern. And so this is just showing that, where these animals occur, we especially don't want to, do things that are going to increase their mortality. And then,
Is it a good way? Sorry, a follow-up question to that.
yeah,
Is it like a good, I guess, a good seeing what's in these bottle traps? Is that a good way of like getting like a sample size of like what the diversity is in that area?
yeah. And like I said, it's very easy. We don't have to set traps because the traps are just there waiting to be found. And they're spread all across all these different habitats and different
Yeah.
places, different elevations. So we have this kind of, I showed you those range maps, but we can kind of map like where this species, the low elevation point for that species and the high elevation point for that species. So we can get kind of increase their distributional maps and habitat associations and so forth.
Great. Wes is asking, what qualities about these bottles do you find them more or less, what qualities about these bottles do you find make them more or less effective as traps?
Um, so I didn't personally look at things like glass versus plastic, or brown bottles versus green bottles versus clear bottles, but other people have. And in general, at least from my study, there doesn't seem to be any difference. A bottle is a bottle as long as it has a narrow neck. So they fall down in there, and then the glass or the plastic is too slippery, and they just can't get back out, or they drown in the water. But if it has a wide opening, like a jar, like a mayonnaise jar, they're more likely to escape. But again, it kind of depends on the position of the bottle. If it's upright, it's just like a bucket pitfall trap. But if it's laying kind of flat, open mouth, they can just crawl back out. But a narrow mouth neck goes up like that, and they can't get out as easily, especially if you're a little shrew.
Great, thank you. Patrick asks, how do you determine population size by region for organisms not in the mountains?
Population size by region. Um, I'm not completely sure what you mean. How do you determine population size by region? Well, at least for
Looks
what
like
I'm
he's
doing, like
clarifying.
I can't really, like, I'm getting these organisms, these samples, but that's not necessarily reflective of like whether the populations are decreasing or not, because I don't have anything to compare it to. All I can say is many of different types of animals are being captured, and they're sometimes being captured at disproportionate rates. Um, but like we didn't get a whole lot of pygmy shrews, for example, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there's fewer pygmy shrews out in the wild. That just means fewer of them got captured. So it's kind of, you can't really use this study in that way easily, at least.
All right, any other questions, folks? All right. Well, if you think of anything else, like I said, I will be sending out a follow-up email, which will include Patrick's email too. Um, I'm sorry, you said that we could contact you directly, right, Patrick? So I could put your email
Yeah, that's
address
fine. You
in
can
the
put
email. Okay, cool.
is P Brannon at the email.wcu for Western Carolina University.edu. But if you go to our
Perfect.
website, and look under like staff,
Outreach
it's there
and
there too.
staff.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Very
And it
cool.
says under contact outreach.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you everyone for tonight. Thank you, Patrick, for presenting. Just a reminder, I said this already, but in case you missed it, for those seeking your EE credit, you will receive a follow-up email later in the week with the EE form. I'll also be making this recording available on our environmental lecture series. I will send that in the email too. And we hope to see everyone again during our next lecture, which is September 8th. That's going to be with Tracy Feldman. They'll be presenting, it's going to be called Under the Radar, Discovering a World of Overlooked Biodiversity. So looking at updates and insights from 10 years of collaborative research about tiny insects that spend their young lives burrowing inside of leaves and stems. So it should be another fascinating lecture, and I hope to see you guys there. Thanks again, Patrick, and thank you
You're welcome.
everyone for being part of our lecture. I'm going to go
Thank you.
ahead and stop the recording.